I'd walked past that patch of weeds 100 times without giving it a second thought. It sat behind the barn, where the fence sagged and the ground stayed damp after every rain. Tall thistles grew there, tangled with vines and forgotten tools, a sort of graveyard for things that had outlived their usefulness. But that morning, something caught the light just right, a glint of metal half buried under the overgrowth. Curious, I pushed the weeds aside with my boot and saw the shape of a rusted machine frame. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized it immediately. Grandpa's cedar, the one he used back when soybeans were just starting to take off around here. I hadn't seen it since I was a kid. Everyone assumed it had been hauled off for scrap years ago. I knelt down, brushing away dirt and dead leaves. The paint was almost completely gone, the wheels frozen, and the seed boxes filled with nothing but brittle husks and cobwebs. It was a wreck, but under all that rust, there was something familiar, the craftsmanship, the old lettering, the way the bolts were hand-fitted. Grandpa built things to last. I stood up and looked around the farm. The new equipment sat lined up by the shed, shiny and efficient. But somehow, that broken cedar stirred something in me. A memory, a challenge, maybe both. I didn't plan it, but right then and there I decided I was going to bring it back to life. The next morning, before the sun had fully climbed over the hills, I was already behind the barn with gloves on and a pair of pruning shears in my back pocket. Dew soaked through my boots as I pushed through the waist-high weeds. From a distance, the cedar looked even worse than I remembered. The vines had wrapped themselves tightly around the frame, like the land itself was trying to hold on to it. I started cutting slowly, clearing away the green curtain that had hidden it for so many years. It took longer than I expected. Every rusted bolt and cracked board told a story of neglect. By the time I uncovered the wheels, my hands were scratched and my shirt clung to me with sweat. But when the sun finally hit the cedar directly, something changed. The morning light revealed details I hadn't noticed before. The faint trace of my grandfather's initials etched into the side, the worn handles shaped by his calloused hands, the faded red paint still clinging stubbornly in a few protected spots. I attached a chain from the tractor to the front hitch and eased forward carefully. At first, the cedar didn't budge. The wheels were sunk deep into the soil, almost as if it had grown roots of its own. But after a few tries, the ground gave way with a groan, and the machine lurched forward, free for the first time in decades. Watching it emerge from that tangle of weeds felt strangely emotional. I remembered Grandpa's voice, his patient way of explaining every gear and lever when I was little. For a moment, it was like he was there beside me again. I parked the tractor and walked around the cedar slowly. The real work was about to begin. Once the cedar was out in the open, I could finally see just how much time had taken its toll. Years of rain and sun had left the metal pitted and brittle in places. The wooden box tops were warped, and the paint that once shone bright red was now little more than flaky rust. I crouched down beside one of the wheels and turned it slowly by hand. At first it resisted, then groaned loudly, and finally gave a reluctant spin, flinging bits of dried mud like it was coughing after a long sleep. I grabbed a rag from my back pocket and began wiping away layers of dirt and cobwebs. The seed tubes were clogged with old debris, some even packed with mouse nests. The chain mechanisms were stiff but intact. I ran my hand along the metal frame and felt that old, solid construction you just don't see anymore. Grandpa always believed that machines had souls if you treated them right, and this one seemed to be waiting patiently for someone to care again. A few bolts were missing, some hinges were broken, and one of the discs was bent out of shape, but overall, it wasn't beyond saving. I made a mental list as I inspected. New bearings, fresh grease, a good sandblasting, some welding, and a lot of patience. Standing back, I took a deep breath and let the cool morning air fill my lungs. Around me, the fields were quiet, except for the distant hum of a neighbor's tractor. This old cedar didn't belong in a junkyard. It deserved a second chance. I ran my hand over Grandpa's faded initials again. "All right, old friend," I whispered. "Let's see what we can do." The project had officially begun. The first week of work was slow and dirty. Every evening after finishing my regular chores, I'd head back to the shed where I'd park the cedar and get to work. I started by removing the worst of the rust using a wire brush and a grinder. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air, echoing through the quiet farmyard as the sun dipped low behind the trees. Rust dust coated my arms, my shirt, even my hair, but beneath it all, the cedar slowly began to reveal its bones again. It wasn't just mechanical work, it was personal. With every bolt I loosened and every part I cleaned, memories of Grandpa surfaced. I remembered the way he used to kneel by this very machine, tightening bolts with steady hands, explaining how the seed flow had to be even, how patience meant everything in farming. "A machine will treat you the way you treat it," he used to say. At the time, I thought it was just one of his folksy sayings. Now I understood. One evening, while scrubbing the inside of the seed box, I found a small metal washer wedged in a corner. It was hand-stamped with the year 1978, the year Grandpa bought the cedar. I turned it over in my fingers, imagining him younger, stronger, full of plans for the farm. That little washer felt like a message left behind. By the end of the week, the frame was nearly cleaned, and I'd begun taking apart the gears. Some pieces crumbled in my hands, while others were surprisingly intact. The mix of decay and resilience mirrored the land itself, worn down by time, but still full of life if you're willing to work for it. This wasn't just a repair job anymore, it was a restoration of legacy. The days started blending together. I'd finish my regular work on the fields, grab some dinner, then disappear into the shed for hours. The old workbench was covered with parts, bolts, bearings, washers, and grease-stained rags scattered in a kind of organized chaos only I could understand. The single hanging light above the bench cast a warm circle across the space, leaving the corners of the shed in shadow. It was quiet there, just the sound of tools clinking, the occasional hiss of the grinder, and the steady rhythm of my breathing. Some nights stretched past midnight. I'd lose track of time, fully absorbed in taking apart each mechanism, cleaning it, and figuring out how to bring it back to life. There was a kind of peace in that solitude, like the shed itself existed outside of time. I'd catch myself humming old songs Grandpa used to play on the radio, songs that smelled like diesel and summer storms. It felt like he was there with me, watching, maybe even nodding in approval. Replacing the bearings was the toughest job so far. The old ones were welded in place by rust and years of neglect. It took a torch, a hammer, and more patience than I thought I had to finally knock them loose. When the new ones clicked in, smooth and perfect, I felt a surge of pride. I kept a small notebook on the workbench where I wrote down every repair I made, not because I had to, but because it felt right, like documenting a story. By the end of that week, the cedar was stripped down to its core and slowly, piece by piece, coming back together. Those nights were exhausting, but they gave me something I didn't realize I'd been missing: purpose. By the time the weekend came, the cedar looked less like a forgotten relic and more like a machine ready for its second chance. I had sanded down the frame, applied a protective coat to fight off more rust, and greased every moving part until they shone under the shed light. The seed boxes were cleaned, patched, and reassembled. The chains hung neatly in place, and the discs had been straightened and sharpened. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it finally looked alive again. That Saturday morning, I decided to take it out for a test. I hitched the cedar to the tractor slowly, checking every connection twice. It felt strange, like reuniting two old friends who hadn't spoken in years. As I climbed into the tractor seat, I caught myself holding my breath. With a low rumble, the tractor began to crawl forward, pulling the cedar across the dirt lane beside the barn. At first, the wheels hesitated, stiff from decades of sitting still. Then, with a rusty groan, they began to turn. Dust and dried soil broke loose from the rims, swirling around in the morning air. I watched the chains rattle into motion, the gears clacking like an old clock, finding its rhythm again. It wasn't smooth, but it was movement, real, honest movement. I jumped down from the tractor to walk alongside, listening carefully. Some parts creaked, others hummed just fine. It was music to my ears. I felt something warm rise in my chest, a mix of pride and nostalgia. Grandpa had pushed this very cedar across these fields decades ago, and now, here I was, watching it roll again. For the first time since finding it in the weeds, I knew this project was going to work. Once I knew the cedar could move, it was time to give it back some of its dignity. The next few days were all about sanding, priming, and painting. I set up a temporary workspace outside the shed, laid down a tarp, and propped the cedar up on blocks. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm sun, and just enough breeze to keep the air from getting still. I spent hours with the sander, stripping away the last stubborn flakes of rust and old paint. Underneath all that wear, the metal still had strength left. I applied the primer carefully, making sure to cover every corner and joint. Watching that dull grey coat dry felt like seeing the machine take its first deep breath. Then came the paint. I'd managed to find a shade of red that matched the original as closely as possible. As the first strokes went on, the transformation was almost magical. The cedar, which had looked tired and forgotten for so long, suddenly stood out bold and bright under the sunlight. The neighbors passing by on the road slowed their trucks to look. Some even honked. One old farmer I'd known for years shouted, "That's the way to do it," before driving off. Their reactions filled me with quiet pride. I wasn't just restoring a tool. I was reviving a piece of history. By the time I finished the final coat, the sun was dipping low, and the cedar glowed a deep, warm red. I stood back and looked at it for a long time, paint-stained gloves hanging at my sides. It looked strong again, useful, ready. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I could almost hear Grandpa chuckling, proud of the job I'd done. With the cedar now shining in its fresh red coat, it was time to make sure it actually worked the way it should. Restoration wasn't just about looks. It had to plant evenly and reliably, or all that effort would mean nothing. Early one morning, with the fog still hanging low over the fields, I rolled the cedar out of the shed and parked it near the south field. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh grass, and everything was quiet except for the chirping of birds. I opened up the seed boxes and cleaned them one last time, brushing out any stray dust or paint flakes. Then I filled them carefully with soybean seeds from last season's stock, watching the little tan grains tumble and settle into place. Grandpa always said the secret to a good planting was in the calibration, the careful balance between seed flow, ground speed, and soil condition. He could adjust this machine by ear, just listening to the gears. I didn't have that kind of magic, but I had patience. I started by walking alongside the cedar as the tractor moved slowly down a test strip. The chains rattled, the discs cut into the damp soil, and the seeds began to fall. I stopped frequently to check the spacing. At first it was uneven, too many seeds in some rows, barely any in others. But with each pass, I made small tweaks, tightening a lever here, adjusting a spring there, cleaning a clogged tube. Hours slipped by, and the sun climbed higher, burning away the fog. Eventually, I stood back and looked at the last test row. The spacing was neat and consistent, just the way Grandpa used to insist on. For the first time, the old cedar felt truly alive again, ready for real work. The morning of planting day arrived with that special kind of quiet you only get at the start of a big job. The sky was pale blue, streaked with soft clouds, and the fields were perfectly dry, ideal conditions. I woke up earlier than usual, made a strong pot of coffee, and stood on the porch for a minute just breathing in the cool air. Out by the shed, the cedar waited, gleaming faintly red in the early light. It looked proud, like it knew what was coming. I hitched it to the tractor, double-checked the chains, seed boxes and settings, then climbed into the seat. As the engine came to life, a familiar sense of focus settled over me. This was it. All those late nights, hours of sanding, fixing and adjusting were about to be put to the test. The first pass down the field was slow. I kept one eye on the soil behind me, making sure the seeds were dropping cleanly and evenly. The smell of freshly turned earth rose up, rich and grounding. With each row, my confidence grew. The cedar moved steadily, its gears clacking in rhythm with the engine, like two old workers who'd known each other forever. By mid-morning, I had settled into a steady pace. Row after row fell into perfect lines, the soybean seeds disappearing into the soil like they belonged there. Sweat ran down my back and the sun climbed higher, but I didn't care. There was something deeply satisfying about watching this old machine do exactly what it was built to do, just like Grandpa had all those years ago. When I reached the end of the final row, I shut off the engine and looked out over the field. Straight lines, clean spacing, promise planted. The days after planting were always a strange mix of hope and patience. Once the seeds were in the ground, there was nothing left to do but wait and trust the soil to do its work. Every morning before chores, I'd walk the edges of the field with my coffee in hand, scanning the rows for any signs of trouble. Pests, birds, too much rain, too little. This year, though, I felt a different kind of anticipation. I wasn't just waiting for a crop. I was waiting to see if Grandpa's cedar had really done its job. The weather cooperated better than I could have hoped. Gentle rains came at just the right times, and the sun warmed the soil during the days that followed. About a week in, I saw the first faint green shoots poking through the dirt, tiny soybean plants reaching up toward the light. I crouched down to inspect them closely. The spacing was almost perfect. Row after row, the plants were lined up neatly, evenly, just the way Grandpa used to like it. As more shoots emerged over the next days, my confidence grew. The field started to change color, shifting from brown to a soft, vibrant green. Neighbors driving by slowed their trucks to look, probably curious why I'd been out here fussing with that old cedar for weeks. Some waved, others gave thumbs up. I didn't need their approval, but it still felt good. At night, I'd sit on the porch watching the sunset stretch over the growing field. There was something peaceful about it, like the land was responding to care, not just modern machinery. I'd taken a chance on something old, something almost forgotten. And day by day, it was proving itself worthy again. By midsummer, the soybean field was a sea of green. Walking between the rows felt different this year. The plants were strong, thick-stemmed and vibrant, their leaves wide and healthy. I ran my hand lightly across the tops as I moved through, feeling the soft resistance as they brushed against my fingers. The spacing was beautiful. Clean rows, even growth. It was, without question, the best stand I'd ever had. I'd been farming long enough to know when a season had potential, and this one did. Everything lined up perfectly. The rain, the timing, the soil conditions, and somehow, Grandpa's old cedar. I couldn't help but smile as I thought about it. That machine had been left to rot behind the barn, forgotten like some relic of a past generation. Yet here it was, delivering results that put my newer expensive equipment to shame. Neighbors started to notice too. They'd stop their trucks by the fence and call out things like, "What'd you do different this year?" or "That's some fine planting you got there." I'd just shrug and say, "Went back to the basics." I didn't feel the need to tell them every detail. Some stories are better kept quiet, at least for a while. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light over the field, I stood by the fence and thought of Grandpa. He would have loved this. He would have walked these rows with that half smile of his, pretending not to be impressed, but proud all the same. It struck me then that this wasn't just a good crop. It was proof that some things, like craftsmanship, patience, and legacy, don't fade with time. They just wait for someone to bring them back. When harvest finally came, the field was ready in a way I'd never seen before. The soybeans stood tall and even, their pods full and dry, rattling softly in the breeze like tiny applause. I climbed into the combine early that morning, just as the first light crept over the horizon. There was a quiet excitement in the air, the kind that comes after months of hard work, when everything you hoped for is finally about to be tested. As I steered the combine into the first row, the header cut smoothly through the plants, feeding them into the machine in a steady rhythm. The yield monitor started ticking upward almost immediately, higher than usual. I slowed down just to make sure it wasn't a glitch, but it wasn't. Row after row, the numbers stayed strong. This wasn't just a good harvest, it was my best one yet. I thought back to that morning months ago, when I found the cedar tangled in weeds behind the barn. If someone had told me then that this forgotten relic would help produce my highest yielding field, I probably would have laughed. But here I was, watching those soybeans pour into the hopper, feeling a mix of pride, gratitude, and something deeper I couldn't quite name. As the sun climbed higher, the golden dust from the harvest hung in the air, glowing like memory itself. I imagined Grandpa riding beside me, nodding quietly the way he used to when things went right. Not with big words, but with that steady, approving presence. Thank you for listening to my story. If it spoke to you, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more farm stories like this one.